Nora Graham clutched her handwritten poems to her chest as the stagecoach rattled into Lyndon, Kansas, her heart pounding with both hope and terror at the thought of reciting her work at the town's first ever literary gathering. If only she could find the courage to share the words that had been her only companions during the long journey west from Boston. The year was 1876, and Lyndon was hardly more than a collection of weathered buildings sprawled along a dusty main street. After the death of her parents, Nora had answered an advertisement from the town's newly established school, which sought a teacher with refined sensibilities and Eastern education. At 22, with no family left and a teaching certificate in hand, she had packed her meager belongings, including the leather-bound journal containing her poetry words never shared with another living soul. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the Lyndon Hotel, a two-story clapboard building that dominated one end of the main street. Nora adjusted her bonnet and smoothed her travel-worn navy dress. She had spent her last dollars on this journey, leaving just enough for 1 week's boarding until her first payment as the town's new schoolteacher. "Last stop, Lyndon," called the driver, a weathered man with a bushy gray beard. "All passengers disembark." Nora was the last to climb down, her legs stiff from the 3-day journey. The driver handed her the small trunk containing her possessions, and she stood uncertainly on the boardwalk, taking in her new home. The town was busier than she'd expected. Men in dusty clothes moved purposefully between the general store, the saloon, and what appeared to be a blacksmith shop. A few women in practical dresses hurried along the boardwalk, market baskets over their arms. It was nothing like Boston with its cobblestone streets and brick buildings, but there was an energy to Lyndon that surprised her. "Miss Graham," a woman in her 40s approached, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun. "I'm Mrs. Whittaker, head of the school board." "We've been expecting you." Nora extended her hand. "Yes, thank you for meeting me. The journey was long but uneventful." Mrs. Whittaker's eyes narrowed as she assessed Nora from head to toe. "You're younger than we expected. The school term begins in 3 days. I hope you're prepared." "I assure you, I am fully qualified. We shall see." Mrs. Whittaker cut her off. "Your room is prepared at Mrs. Jensen's boarding house. It's just down the street. The school is at the end of town, past the church. You'll report there tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock to prepare your classroom." Without waiting for a response, Mrs. Whittaker turned and walked away, leaving Nora standing alone with her trunk. Taking a deep breath, she bent to pick it up. "Allow me, madam." A deep voice startled her. Nora straightened and found herself face to face with a tall man in dusty trail clothes. His face was tanned and weathered beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but his blue eyes were kind. He couldn't have been more than 30, with broad shoulders and the easy stance of a man comfortable in his own skin. "I couldn't help overhearing. You must be the new schoolteacher." He picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing. "Name's Mason Archer. Most folks just call me Mace. Nora Graham." She extended her hand before realizing it might be improper. To her relief, he shifted the trunk to one arm and shook her hand firmly. "Welcome to Lyndon, Miss Graham." "Don't mind Mrs. Whittaker. She's been running this town since her husband died in '69. Heart's in the right place, though." They began walking down the boardwalk, Mason carrying her trunk with ease. "Have you lived in Lyndon long, Mr. Archer?" Nora asked, trying to match his long strides. "Born and raised on a ranch outside of town. Just got back from driving cattle to Wichita." He glanced at her. "What brings a Boston lady like yourself all the way to Kansas?" Nora blinked in surprise. "How did you know I'm from Boston?" He chuckled. "Your accent. Plus, those shoes aren't made for prairie dust." Nora looked down at her once fine leather boots, now coated with a layer of Kansas soil. I suppose not. They stopped in front of a tidy white house with a small sign that read Jensen's boarding house. Here we are. Mason set her trunk on the porch. Mrs. Jensen makes the best apple pie in the county. Be sure to mention you're partial to it. Nora smiled. Thank you for your help, Mr. Archer. Mace, he corrected. And it was my pleasure, Miss Graham. He tipped his hat and turned to leave, then paused. There's a literary gathering at the church hall tomorrow evening. Some folks reading poetry and such. You might find it interesting being from back east. Nora's heart skipped a beat. Poetry? Yes, madam. Town's trying to get some culture, I suppose. 7 o'clock. With another tip of his hat, he walked away, his spurs jingling softly with each step. Nora watched him go, her journal of poems suddenly feeling heavy in her hands. Mrs. Jensen proved to be a plump, cheerful widow in her 60s who showed Nora to a small but clean room on the second floor. Bathrooms at the end of the hall, she explained. Supper's at 6 sharp. Don't be late or you'll miss my apple pie. Nora smiled, remembering Mason's advice. I've heard your apple pie is the best in the county. Mrs. Jensen beamed. You heard right. Who told you that? A Mr. Archer. Mace Archer. Mrs. Jensen's expression softened. Ah, young Mace. Good boy, that one. His father was one of the first settlers here, built the biggest ranch in the territory before the war. Mace runs it now with his younger brother since their pa passed on last winter. After Mrs. Jensen left, Nora unpacked her few belongings and sat on the bed, opening her journal. Pages of carefully penned verses stared back at her. Tomorrow evening. A poetry reading. The thought made her stomach twist with both longing and terror. Her mother had always encouraged her writing, but her father, a stern Boston banker, had considered it a frivolous pastime. Words won't put food on the table, Nora, he'd say whenever he caught her writing. After they both died of influenza 2 years ago, her poetry had become her closest companion, a secret refuge where she could express the emotions she kept carefully hidden from the world. Could she find the courage to share her words in this new place? The very thought made her hands tremble. The next morning, Nora reported to the schoolhouse as instructed. It was a one-room building with rows of simple wooden desks facing a teacher's desk on a raised platform. A blackboard covered most of the front wall, and bookshelves lined the back. To her surprise, the room was clean and well-maintained, with fresh chalk and a stack of primers waiting on her desk. Mrs. Whittaker was there with 2 other women from the school board. They watched as Nora moved about the room, familiarizing herself with the textbooks and supplies. We have 23 students enrolled, Mrs. Whittaker informed her. Ages 6 to 16. The older boys only attend during winter months when they're not needed on the farms. I understand, Nora said, examining the worn readers and arithmetic books. Is there a library in town? The 3 women exchanged glances. Not as such, one of them admitted, but Reverend Porter has quite a collection of books he's willing to lend. And there's the Literary Society, the youngest of the 3 added. They're hosting a reading tonight at the church hall. Yes, I heard about that, Nora said, trying to sound casual. It sounds lovely, Mrs. Whittaker frowned. It's Judge Parker's idea. He believes culture will attract more settlers. Personally, I think practical skills are more valuable out here. After the women left, Nora spent the day organizing her classroom and preparing lessons. By late afternoon, she was satisfied with her preparations and returned to the boarding house to change for supper. As she washed the dust from her face, Nora debated whether to attend the literary gathering. Part of her longed to be among people who valued poetry, but the thought of being in a room full of strangers made her anxiety rise. And what if they asked her to read? The very thought made her palms sweat. At supper, Mrs. Jensen chattered about town gossip while serving generous portions of roast chicken, potatoes, and vegetables. True to her reputation, the apple pie was exceptional. "Will you be attending the poetry reading tonight, Miss Graham?" Mrs. Jensen asked as she poured coffee. I'm not sure." Nora hesitated. "I don't know anyone yet." "Nonsense. It's the perfect way to meet folks." Mrs. Jensen's tone brooked no argument. "Why, half the town will be there, including several eligible bachelors." Nora felt her cheeks warm. "I'm not looking for a husband, Mrs. Jensen. I came here to teach." "Of course, dear." The older woman patted her hand, but no harm in making acquaintances. At 6:45, Nora found herself walking toward the church hall, her journal tucked into her reticule. She'd changed into her best dress, a dark green wool with a lace collar, and arranged her chestnut hair in a simple but elegant knot at the nape of her neck. The church hall was already half full when she arrived. Rows of chairs faced a small stage where a podium had been placed. Oil lamps cast a warm glow over the assembled townspeople, who were chatting amiably as they found their seats. Nora slipped into a chair in the back row, hoping to remain unnoticed. She scanned the crowd, surprised by the diverse gathering. Merchants in their Sunday best sat alongside ranchers in clean but well-worn clothes. Several women her own age were seated together, whispering behind gloved hands. "Didn't expect to see you here." Nora turned to find Mason Archer settling into the empty seat beside her. He was dressed more formally than the day before in a clean white shirt, dark vest, and string tie, his hat nowhere in sight. His dark hair was still damp from washing, curling slightly over his forehead. "I thought I should see what Lyndon has to offer in terms of culture," Nora replied, suddenly conscious of how close he was sitting. "And what do you think so far?" His blue eyes held a hint of amusement. "I reserve judgment until I've heard the poetry." He laughed softly. "Fair enough. Though I should warn you, Judge Parker's idea of poetry tends toward the patriotic and bombastic." Before she could reply, a tall man with silver hair and an impressive mustache stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Lyndon's first literary gathering. I am Judge Samuel Parker, and it is my pleasure to bring a touch of civilization to our growing community. We will begin with readings from America's finest poets, followed by several original works by our own citizens. First, Mrs. Whitaker will favor us with The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow." As Mrs. Whitaker took the stage and began to recite in a clear, schoolteacher's voice, Nora felt Mason lean closer. "She practices that one for weeks," he whispered. "Does it every 4th of July, too?" Nora suppressed a smile, trying to focus on the familiar verses. The evening progressed with various townspeople reading selections from Whitman, Bryant, and Emerson. Some read well, others stumbled through the verses, but all were received with enthusiastic applause. "And now," announced Judge Parker after about an hour, "we invite any in the audience who have brought original compositions to come forward and share their work." A hush fell over the crowd. Nora felt her heart begin to race. Her journal seemed to burn inside her reticule. She had brought it, hadn't she? Part of her had hoped for this moment, had longed to share the words that flowed from her heart onto paper. A young man finally stood and made his way to the podium. He read a sonnet about prairie wildflowers that, while earnest, was somewhat clumsy in its execution. The audience applauded politely when he finished. 2 more brave souls followed with their own compositions, an ode to cattle driving and a sentimental verse about a lost love. As the second reader returned to his seat, Judge Parker looked around expectantly. Anyone else? Surely there are more literary minds among us. Nora's hand tightened on her reticule. She could feel Mason watching her. "You brought something, didn't you?" he murmured. She nodded almost imperceptibly, her throat dry. "Then share it," he encouraged. "I can't," she whispered. "I've never read my poetry aloud before. First time for everything." Judge Parker was about to close the readings when Mason raised his hand. "Judge, I believe Miss Graham has something to share." All heads turned toward her. Nora felt her face flame as Judge Parker smiled broadly. "Ah, our new schoolteacher. Please, Miss Graham, come forward." Nora shot Mason a panicked look. "I can't," she hissed. "I'm scared they'll laugh." Mason's expression softened. He leaned close, his voice for her ears alone. "Then I'll laugh first to drown them out." The simple offer, made with such gentle understanding, gave her courage. Slowly, Nora rose to her feet. Her legs felt like water as she made her way to the podium, her journal clutched in trembling hands. Standing before the assembled townspeople, she opened her journal to a page marked with a pressed wildflower. She took a deep breath, raised her eyes to the crowd, and began to read. "Prairie Dawn," she said softly, giving her poem a title for the first time. "The horizon bleeds crimson and gold, painting the endless grasses in fire. Night retreats slowly, reluctantly, like a lover from a warm bed." Her voice, tentative at first, grew stronger as she continued, the words flowing like a stream finding its course. She forgot about the audience, lost in the imagery of her own creation, the sunrise over the Kansas prairie as viewed from her stagecoach window just days ago. When she finished, there was a moment of profound silence. Nora's heart sank. Then Mason Archer stood and began to applaud, his hands coming together in slow, deliberate claps. Others joined him, and soon the hall echoed with applause. "Magnificent, Miss Graham," Judge Parker declared, returning to the podium as Nora retreated to her seat, her cheeks flushed with emotion. "What a fitting conclusion to our evening. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we can all agree that Lyndon's cultural life has been immeasurably enriched by our new schoolteacher." The gathering broke up shortly after, with townspeople lingering to chat in small groups. Several approached Nora to compliment her poem and welcome her to Lyndon. Mrs. Whittaker grudgingly admitted that perhaps the school board had made a wise choice after all. As the crowd thinned, Nora found herself standing outside the church hall beside Mason. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what? You're the one with the gift." His eyes held genuine admiration. "For giving me the courage," he shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed. "Anyone ever tell you that keeping beauty hidden is a kind of selfishness?" The unexpected philosophical turn surprised her. "No, they haven't." "Well, it is. Whether it's a sunset or a poem or—" He hesitated, his eyes briefly dropping to her lips before meeting her gaze again. "Or anything else worth seeing in this world." The air between them seemed to vibrate with unspoken possibilities. Then Mason cleared his throat and stepped back slightly. "May I walk you to your boarding house, Miss Graham?" "Yes, thank you, Mr. Archer." "Mace," he reminded her gently. "Mace," she agreed, liking the feel of his name on her lips. "And you may call me Nora if you wish." They walked in companionable silence through the quiet town, the stars brilliant in the clear Kansas sky. At Mrs. Jensen's gate, they paused. "Will you be at the school picnic on Sunday?" Mason asked. "It's tradition before the term starts. Lets the children meet their new teacher in a less formal setting." "Yes, Mrs. Whittaker mentioned it. I'll be there." "Good." He seemed about to say more, then thought better of it. "Good night, Nora, and congratulations on your debut as a poet." "Good night, Mace, and thank you again." As she watched him walk away, Nora felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time, a sense of belonging, of possibility. Perhaps Lyndon, Kansas, with its dusty streets and straightforward people, might become more than just a place to escape her grief. Perhaps it might become home. The next 3 days passed in a whirl of activity as Nora prepared for her first day of teaching. The school board provided a list of students, and she carefully memorized each name, determined to greet every child personally on their first day. She arranged her classroom, planned her lessons, and in the evenings wrote in her journal, inspired by her new surroundings. Sunday arrived bright and clear, a perfect September day for the school picnic. The event was held in a meadow beside the creek that ran behind the church. When Nora arrived, carrying a basket containing a berry cobbler made under Mrs. Jensen's supervision, families were already spreading blankets on the grass and setting up tables laden with food. Children ran and played while their parents visited, the atmosphere festive and relaxed. Nora recognized many faces from the poetry reading, but there were others. She hadn't met farmers and ranchers who lived outside town limits, but whose children would be her students. She placed her cobbler among the desserts and stood somewhat uncertainly at the edge of the gathering, not sure where to begin. Miss Graham, a young girl of about 8, approached, her blonde braids bouncing. "I'm Sally Porter. My pa's the Reverend. You're going to be my teacher." Nora smiled, grateful for the child's directness. "Hello, Sally. It's lovely to meet you. You know your letters?" the girl asked seriously. "Miss Wilson, our last teacher, didn't know all her letters. She kept mixing up M and W." "I promise I know all my letters," Nora assured her, amused. "And numbers too." This seemed to satisfy Sally, who promptly took Nora's hand. "Come meet my friends. They want to know if you're strict about spelling." For the next hour, Nora was introduced to what seemed like every child in Lyndon. Some were shy, hiding behind their parents, while others peppered her with questions about Boston and whether she had ever seen the ocean. By the time Reverend Porter called everyone to gather for the blessing before the meal, Nora had spoken with most of her future students and many of their parents. As people settled on blankets and at tables, Nora found herself invited to join the Porters. She was just taking her seat when she spotted Mason arriving with a younger man who shared his features, his brother, she guessed. Mason's eyes scanned the crowd until they found her, and he smiled, raising a hand in greeting. Reverend Porter offered a brief blessing, and the feast began. Platters were passed, plates filled, and conversation flowed freely. Nora was midway through her meal when a shadow fell across her plate. "Room for 2 more?" Mason asked, standing with his brother beside the Porter's blanket. "Of course, Mace." Reverend Porter welcomed them. "Miss Graham, have you met the Archer brothers? Mr. Archer helped me with my trunk when I arrived," Nora explained. "And she's been calling me Mr. Archer ever since, despite my best efforts," Mason added, settling beside her on the blanket. "This is my brother Luke." The younger Archer, who appeared to be in his early 20s, nodded politely. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Graham. Your poem the other night was mighty fine." "Thank you," Nora said, pleased that he had been there. "Do you write poetry as well?" Luke burst out laughing. "Me? No, madam. Mace is the one with the book learning in our family. I just tag along to these things to keep him company." "Luke prefers horses to books," Mason explained, "but he's the best horse trainer in 3 counties. The conversation turned to the upcoming school term, the harvest prospects, and local matters. Nora found herself relaxing, enjoying the easy camaraderie of these people who were quickly becoming less like strangers and more like neighbors. After the meal, games were organized for the children while the adults continued visiting. Nora was helping Mrs. Porter gather empty plates when Mason approached her. "Would you like to see a bit more of Lyndon than just the main street?" he asked. "I could show you the creek. It's quite pretty this time of year." Nora hesitated. Was it proper to go walking alone with a man she barely knew? But they would be in full view of the picnic, and something about Mason Archer's straightforward manner made her trust him instinctively. "I'd like that," she decided. They walked along the creek, Mason pointing out various plants and explaining their uses. "The Indians taught the first settlers which ones were medicinal," he explained, showing her a small flowering plant. "This one's good for headaches." "You know a lot about the land," Nora observed. "Grew up on it. My father believed a man should understand the land he lives on, plants, animals, weather, all of it." He glanced at her. "What about you? What did your father believe in?" "Numbers," Nora said with a small smile. "He was a banker. Everything could be measured, counted, balanced in his ledgers." "And your mother?" Nora's smile turned wistful. "Beauty. Poetry. She's the one who taught me to love words." They had reached a bend in the creek where a large cottonwood tree provided shade. Mason gestured to a smooth rock large enough to serve as a bench. "Shall we sit for a moment?" Once settled, they watched the water flow past, each lost in thought. "Why did you really come to Lyndon?" Mason finally asked, turning to study her face. "It's a long way from Boston, and teaching jobs are plentiful back east." Nora considered deflecting the question, but something in his direct gaze made her want to answer honestly. "After my parents died, there was nothing to keep me in Boston. Just memories and a few distant relatives who made it clear I was a burden." She looked down at her hands. "I wanted to start fresh somewhere no one knew me or my family, somewhere I could be just Nora, not poor Miss Graham, the banker's orphaned daughter." Mason nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Fresh starts are what the West is built on. My father came here after the Mexican War with nothing but a horse and a dream of open spaces. And he built your ranch." "The Arrow Ranch, yes. Started with 20 acres and a dozen longhorns. Now it's 2,000 acres and 500 head of cattle." Pride resonated in his voice. "Luke and I run it together, though he handles more of the day-to-day while I tend to business matters in town." "It sounds wonderful," Nora said sincerely. "It's hard work, but good work." Mason picked up a small stone and skipped it across the creek. "Do you miss Boston?" Nora considered the question. "I miss certain things, bookshops, libraries, the changing seasons, but not enough to go back." "Lyndon has a way of growing on people," Mason said. "It's not Boston, but it has its own kind of beauty." "Yes," Nora agreed, looking at the prairie wildflowers nodding in the breeze. "I'm beginning to see that." They rejoined the picnic as families were starting to pack up. Mason helped gather the remaining dishes and fold blankets, working alongside Nora with an easy efficiency that spoke of a lifetime of practical tasks. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the meadow, Mason offered to walk Nora back to her boarding house. They strolled through town, now familiar to Nora after nearly a week's residence, their conversation moving from local history to books they had both read. "Thoreau." Mason seemed surprised when Nora mentioned the author. "I wouldn't have taken you for a transcendentalist." "Why not?" she challenged, amused by his reaction. "You seem too grounded for someone who advocates living in the woods alone." "Perhaps I contain multitudes, Mr. Archer," she quoted with a smile. "Whitman," he identified immediately. "Now him I can see you appreciating." At Mrs. Jensen's gate, they paused again, neither seemingly eager to end the conversation. "I should let you rest," Mason said finally. "Tomorrow's your first day of teaching." "Yes." Nora felt a flutter of nervousness at the reminder. 23 students, all watching to see if their new teacher knows her letters. "They'll love you," Mason assured her, "just as you charmed the literary society." The compliment warmed her. "Thank you for today, for the walk and the conversation. My pleasure, Miss Graham." His formality was softened by the warmth in his eyes. "Perhaps you might consider joining me for supper one evening this week." Mrs. Hanson at the hotel sets a fine table on Wednesdays. I would like that, Nora said, surprised by her own boldness but unwilling to deny the connection she felt to this thoughtful cowboy. Wednesday, then. 6 o'clock. Wednesday at 6, she confirmed. Mason tipped his hat and bid her good night. Nora watched him walk away, his tall figure silhouetted against the sunset, before turning to enter the boarding house, her mind already skipping ahead to Wednesday evening. The first day of school passed in a blur of introductions, assessments, and establishing routines. Nora found her students eager and mostly well-behaved, though a few of the older boys tested boundaries with whispers and note passing. By the final bell, she was exhausted but satisfied. She had made a good beginning. The next day went more smoothly, and by Wednesday, Nora felt she had a reasonable understanding of each child's abilities and temperament. Sally Porter was bright and curious. The Miller twins were mischievous but quick learners. Young Tommy Jensen, Mrs. Jensen's grandson, struggled with reading but showed remarkable aptitude for numbers. As the children filed out at day's end, Nora realized she had only an hour to return to the boarding house, freshen up, and change for her supper with Mason. She hurried through town, nodding to the shopkeepers and townspeople who called greetings, already becoming a familiar figure in Lyndon. In her room, she changed into her best evening dress, a deep blue silk with modest lace trim at the collar and cuffs. It was slightly out of fashion by Boston standards, but here in Lyndon, it was elegant enough for any occasion. She pinned her hair up more carefully than usual, allowing a few curls to frame her face, and added her mother's pearl earrings, the one piece of jewelry she had kept when settling her parents' affairs. Mrs. Jensen beamed approvingly when Nora came downstairs. "My, don't you look lovely? Off to meet young Archer at the hotel, are you?" News traveled fast in small towns, Nora reflected. "Yes, Mr. Archer invited me to supper. Fine man, Mace Archer, not one for saloons or gambling like some. Runs that ranch of his father's with a steady hand. Church-going too." Mrs. Jensen's tone made it clear these were the highest virtues a man could possess. "It's just supper, Mrs. Jensen," Nora reminded her, though she felt a flutter of anticipation that suggested it might be more. The walk to the hotel took only minutes. The Lyndon Hotel was the grandest building in town, though it would have been considered modest in any eastern city. Its dining room, however, was surprisingly elegant, with white tablecloths, proper silverware, and a small vase of wildflowers on each table. Mason was waiting in the hotel lobby, dressed in a formal suit that transformed him from rugged rancher to gentleman. He looked as nervous as Nora felt, which she found oddly reassuring. "You look beautiful," he said simply when she approached. "Thank you. You're quite handsome yourself." He offered his arm and led her into the dining room, where Mrs. Hanson, the hotel's proprietress, showed them to a corner table partially secluded by a potted palm, an exotic touch in frontier Kansas. The menu was limited but carefully prepared roast beef, chicken, or trout, with seasonal vegetables from Mrs. Hanson's garden. Nora chose the trout while Mason selected the beef. As they waited for their meal, conversation flowed easily between them. "How was your first week of teaching?" Mason asked. "Challenging but rewarding," Nora replied. "The children are eager to learn, though their previous education has been somewhat inconsistent." Miss Wilson was more interested in finding a husband than teaching, Mason explained with a wry smile. She succeeded too. Married the blacksmith's son after just one term and moved to Topeka. "Well, I assure you I'm committed to completing the full school year at the very least," Nora said firmly. "And after that?" Mason's blue eyes held a question. Nora met his gaze steadily. "That depends on many things." The arrival of their meals provided a momentary distraction. The food was excellent, the trout fresh and perfectly cooked, the vegetables seasoned with herbs that reminded Nora of her mother's garden. As they ate, Mason told her more about the Arrow Ranch, about the challenges of the cattle business and his plans for expanding into horse breeding, building on Luke's talent with the animals. Nora found herself genuinely interested, asking questions that revealed her quick mind and practical nature. In turn, she shared stories of her childhood in Boston, of her father's banking house and her mother's literary salon, where poets and writers would gather to read their works and debate ideas. "It sounds like you had a foot in two different worlds," Mason observed. "Yes, I suppose I did. Father wanted me to be practical, to understand business and numbers. Mother wanted me to appreciate beauty and ideas." Nora smiled at the memory. "Somehow I managed to please them both, at least most of the time." "And now, which world calls to you more strongly?" Nora considered the question. "Both, I think. I believe one can be practical and still appreciate beauty. One can keep accurate accounts and write poetry." "Balance," Mason nodded. "That's what my father always sought, a balance between working the land and enjoying its gifts." As they finished their dessert, a delicate apple tart that even Mrs. Jensen would have approved, Nora realized the dining room had emptied around them, the other patrons having finished their meals and departed while they talked. "I've kept you too late," Mason apologized, noticing her glance at the clock. "Not at all. I've enjoyed every moment." And it was true. The evening had passed too quickly. Mason paid their bill and they stepped out into the cool September evening. The stars were brilliant overhead, the Milky Way a pale ribbon across the velvet sky. "I've never seen so many stars," Nora said, her head tilted back to take in the spectacle. "In Boston, the gas lamps and coal smoke hide all but the brightest." "One of the benefits of frontier living," Mason replied, standing close beside her. "Though I suspect Boston has compensations of its own." "It does. But at this moment, I can't think of a single one I'd trade for this sky." They walked slowly toward the boarding house, neither rushing to end the evening. At Mrs. Jensen's gate, they paused again, the moment echoing their previous partings, yet somehow more significant. "Thank you for a lovely evening," Nora said softly. "The pleasure was mine." Mason hesitated, then added, "There's a harvest dance at the Grange Hall next Saturday. Would you do me the honor of accompanying me?" "Yes," Nora answered without hesitation. "I'd like that very much." Mason smiled, his expression a mixture of relief and pleasure. "Until Saturday, then." He took her hand, and, in a gesture more formal than any cowboy she had imagined, raised it to his lips for a brief, warm kiss. "Good night, Nora." "Good night, Mace." As she prepared for bed that night, Nora found herself humming a waltz her mother had often played on the piano. For the first time since arriving in Lyndon, she wrote no poetry. Instead, she lay awake, replaying the evening's conversations and thinking of the stars in Mason Archer's eyes when he had asked her to the dance. The following week established a routine. Nora taught during the day, prepared lessons in the evenings, and twice walked with Mason after school, exploring more of the town and its surroundings. On Thursday, he showed her the small but ambitious town library being assembled in a back room of the general store. On Friday, they walked to the edge of town where the prairie stretched unbroken to the horizon, the tall grasses rippling like a tawny sea in the breeze. Saturday arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect weather for the harvest dance. Nora spent extra time on her appearance, wearing her second-best dress, a warm russet color that complemented her chestnut hair and brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. Mason arrived at the boarding house promptly at 7, driving a polished buggy pulled by a handsome bay horse. Luke accompanied them, sitting in the back and regaling Nora with stories of the local characters they would meet at the dance. The Grange Hall was festooned with autumn decorations, dried corn stalks, pumpkins, and colorful leaves arranged artfully around the spacious room. A small band consisting of a fiddler, a banjo player, and an accordion player was setting up on a raised platform at one end. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the gathering crowd. "Miss Graham," Sally Porter rushed up as soon as they entered. "You look so pretty. Will you dance with my pa? Mama's in heaven now and he never dances." Nora smiled at the child's directness. "If your father asks me, I'd be happy to dance with him, Sally." This seemed to satisfy the girl, who skipped off to join her friends. Mason chuckled beside her. "Sally's been trying to find her father a new wife since her mother died 2 years ago. You're not the first new woman in town she's approached." "Poor Reverend Porter," Nora said, watching the tall, solemn man speaking with the elders near the refreshment table. "It can't be easy raising a child alone." "No," Mason agreed, his expression thoughtful. "It takes a special kind of strength." The band began to play, and couples moved onto the floor for the first dance, a lively Virginia reel. Mason offered his arm to Nora. "Shall we?" Dancing with Mason proved to be a revelation. Despite his size and the rugged nature of his daily work, he moved with surprising grace, guiding Nora through the patterns of the dance with confidence. She found herself laughing as they circled and turned, caught up in the music and the joy of movement. As the evening progressed, Nora danced not only with Mason but with several other men: Luke Archer, Judge Parker, and yes, Reverend Porter, who thanked her awkwardly for her kindness to his daughter. She also conversed with many of the women, finding them warm and welcoming now that she was no longer a complete stranger. During a break in the dancing, Mason brought her a cup of punch and led her to a quiet corner where they could catch their breath. "You're popular tonight," he observed, a hint of possessiveness in his tone. "Just a novelty," Nora demurred. "The new face in town." "I think it's more than that." Mason's eyes held hers. "You bring something special to Lyndon, Nora, a kind of light." The compliment touched her deeply. "What a lovely thing to say. Just the truth." He set down his cup. "Would you like to step outside for a moment? It's getting warm in here." The night air was cool and refreshing after the heat of the crowded hall. They walked a short distance from the building, the music fading to a pleasant background melody. The moon was nearly full, silvering the landscape and casting long shadows. "I never thought I could feel at home here," Nora admitted, breaking a comfortable silence. "Kansas seemed so foreign, so far from everything I knew. But now," Mason prompted when she hesitated, "now I'm beginning to see its beauty, to feel connected to this place and its people." Mason moved closer, his voice low. "To any people in particular?" Nora's heart quickened. "Perhaps." He reached for her hand, his fingers warm and strong as they entwined with hers. "Nora, I know we've known each other only a short time, but I find myself thinking about you constantly. Your intelligence, your courage in coming out here alone, your poetry." "My poetry." She was surprised he had mentioned it specifically. "Yes, it reveals something about you, a depth, a way of seeing the world that's special." He turned to face her fully. "I'd like to court you properly, if you're willing, to see where this connection between us might lead." The directness of his proposal took her breath away. In Boston, courtship was a carefully choreographed dance of formal calls, chaperoned outings, and oblique conversations. Mason Archer's straightforward approach was refreshingly honest. "I'd like that," she said simply, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. Relief and joy transformed his features. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, Mason leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. Nora responded with a tentative pressure of her own, her free hand coming to rest on his shoulder. The kiss was brief but perfect, a promise rather than a demand. When they drew apart, Mason's smile held a hint of wonder. "I've been wanting to do that since the poetry reading." "I'm glad you waited," Nora replied with a small smile. "A lady prefers not to be kissed in public by a man she's just met. And now I'm quite content with your timing, Mr. Archer." They returned to the dance, both a little flushed but happily aware of the shift in their relationship. For the remainder of the evening, Mason kept Nora close, dancing only with her for the slower numbers and watching proudly as she continued to charm the townspeople during the livelier tunes. As September gave way to October, Nora settled into life in Lyndon. Her days were filled with teaching, her evenings often spent with Mason. He called at the boarding house 3 times a week, taking her for drives in his buggy, walking with her along the creek, or simply sitting on Mrs. Jensen's porch swing, talking until the stars came out. On Sundays, Nora attended church with Mrs. Jensen, usually joining the Archers for dinner afterward at their ranch house, a spacious, well-built home that spoke of prosperity without ostentation. She grew to appreciate Luke's quiet humor and to understand the bond between the brothers, forged in the hard work of running their father's legacy. Mason courted her with a blend of frontier practicality and surprising romanticism. He brought her wildflowers gathered during his rides across the prairie, and books ordered specially from Kansas City. He listened attentively when she read her poetry aloud and shared with her his own love of literature, revealing a mind as cultivated as any Boston intellectual despite his frontier upbringing. By late October, as the first frost silvered the prairie grass and the trees along the creek turned gold and crimson, Nora realized she had fallen deeply in love with Mason Archer. The realization came not as a sudden shock, but as a quiet certainty, as natural as the changing seasons. One crisp Sunday afternoon, Mason drove her out to a high point on the Arrow Ranch property, a gentle rise that offered a panoramic view of the rolling prairie and the distant outline of Lyndon. "My father called this Lookout Hill," Mason explained as he spread a blanket on the ground and helped Nora from the buggy. "He said a man should always know what he's protecting." They sat on the blanket, sharing a picnic prepared by Mrs. Jensen: cold chicken, apple tarts, and a jug of fresh cider. The autumn sun was warm on their faces despite the cool air. "It's beautiful," Nora said, gazing at the landscape. The prairie had turned tawny with autumn, dotted with the rich reds and golds of sumac and cottonwood. "I can see why your father loved this land." "He did." Mason's voice was thoughtful. "He used to bring me up here when I was a boy, point to the horizon and tell me that everything I could see was part of our story, past, present, and future. A wonderful legacy to pass on." "Yes." Mason turned to face her, his expression suddenly serious. "Nora, there's something I need to ask you." Her heart began to race. "Yes." He took both her hands in his. "These past weeks have been the happiest of my life. Getting to know you, seeing Lyndon through your eyes, hearing your thoughts and dreams. It's changed everything for me." Nora squeezed his hands encouragingly, too moved to speak. "I know it hasn't been long, and I know you came here to start a new life, to be independent. I respect that more than I can say." Mason's blue eyes held hers steadily. "But I can't imagine my future without you in it." "I love you, Nora Graham. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Though she had sensed the conversation's direction, the actual words still left her breathless. For a moment, she could only look at him, taking in the beloved features of his face, the strong jaw, the kind eyes, the small scar above his right eyebrow from a childhood fall. "Mace," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "When I came to Lyndon, I thought I was running away from the past, looking for somewhere to hide my grief. But now I realize I was actually running toward something, toward a future I couldn't have imagined." His expression was a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," Nora said firmly, joy spreading through her like sunlight. "Yes, I will marry you, Mason Archer." His smile was radiant as he pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that spoke of both love and relief. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "This was my mother's," he explained, opening it to reveal a gold ring set with a modest diamond flanked by 2 small sapphires. "My father gave it to her when they decided to make their life here. He said the diamond represented their love, and the sapphires represented the endless Kansas sky they would live under together." Tears filled Nora's eyes as Mason slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. "It's beautiful. I'll treasure it always." They spent the afternoon on Lookout Hill, planning their future together. Mason wanted a December wedding, after the fall cattle sale but before the worst of winter set in. Nora agreed, thinking the Christmas season would be a lovely time to begin their marriage. "Will you continue teaching after we're married?" Mason asked as they packed up the remains of their picnic. The question pleased her. Many men would have simply assumed she would give up her position. "I'd like to finish the school year at least. The children deserve consistency." Mason nodded. "I thought you might feel that way. We can make it work. The ranch house is only a 20-minute ride from town." As they drove back toward Lyndon, the sunset painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Nora felt a profound contentment. She had found not only love but a partner who valued her mind and respected her independence, a rare combination in any time or place. Mrs. Jensen was delighted by the news of their engagement, declaring she had seen it coming from the very first day. She immediately offered to help with wedding preparations and insisted on hosting an engagement supper the following weekend for the couple and their closest friends. The town reacted to the announcement with general approval and not a little satisfaction. It seemed many had been watching the courtship with interest, placing discreet wagers on when Mason Archer would finally propose to the schoolteacher from Boston. Nora wrote to her aunt in Boston, her only remaining family, sharing her happiness and extending an invitation to the wedding, though she doubted the elderly woman would undertake such a journey in winter. The letter was difficult to write. Her aunt had never approved of her decision to go west, but Nora felt it was important to maintain the connection, tenuous though it was. As the weeks passed and December approached, wedding preparations occupied much of Nora's free time. The ceremony would be held in the church, with Reverend Porter officiating. The reception would follow at the Grange Hall, with the entire town invited to celebrate. Nora continued teaching, finding joy in her students' progress and in their excitement about her upcoming marriage. Sally Porter was especially thrilled, appointing herself unofficial wedding consultant and offering suggestions ranging from practical to fanciful. "You should have real flowers, Miss Graham," she insisted during lunch break one day in mid-November. "Not just dried ones. Mr. Archer could get them from Kansas City on the train." "In December, Sally." "I'm not sure that's possible," Nora replied gently. "Pa says with God all things are possible," Sally countered with the unassailable logic of childhood faith. The wedding dress presented a challenge. Lyndon's general store offered fabric but no ready-made gowns, and there was no dressmaker in town skilled enough for such an important garment. Mason solved the problem by arranging for Nora to travel with Luke to Topeka, where she could visit a proper dressmaker and select a gown. The 2-day journey in early November was Nora's first time away from Lyndon since her arrival. Luke proved a courteous, if sometimes taciturn, companion, clearly taking his responsibility for his future sister-in-law's safety very seriously. In Topeka, Nora found a dressmaker who had a sample gown that could be altered to fit her in the time available, an elegant creation of ivory satin with lace overlay and a modest train. The dressmaker promised to complete the alterations and ship the gown to Lyndon by the first week of December, well before the Christmas Eve wedding date. The capital city also offered other shopping opportunities. Nora purchased gifts for Mason and Luke, fabric for curtains for their future home, and a journal bound in blue leather to replace her current one, which was nearly full. When they returned to Lyndon, Mason was waiting at the station, his face lighting up at the sight of Nora descending from the train. Despite Luke's presence and the public setting, he embraced her warmly, whispering, "2 days is too long to be apart." Nora agreed wholeheartedly. The separation, brief though it was, had confirmed the depth of her feelings. Lyndon was home now because Mason was there. As December arrived, bringing with it colder temperatures and the season's first snow, final wedding preparations accelerated. The wedding dress arrived as promised, fitting perfectly after Nora's Topeka fittings. Mrs. Jensen helped her prepare her trousseau, offering practical advice about running a ranch household. A week before the wedding, Mason took Nora to the ranch house, which would soon be her home as well. "I've had the women come in and give it a thorough cleaning," he explained as he showed her through the spacious main floor. "And I've cleared out the small room next to the library for your writing. I thought you might want a space of your own." The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought tears to Nora's eyes. "It's perfect." Mason showed her the master bedroom, a large corner room with windows facing east and south, furnished with his parents' massive oak bed, a dresser, and a washstand. "We can change anything you don't like," he said, watching her reaction closely. "I wouldn't change a thing," Nora assured him, moved by his obvious desire to make her comfortable in his family home. They returned to the parlor, where Luke had tactfully remained, keeping the proprieties despite his role as chaperone. The three discussed plans for Christmas, which would be Nora's first in her new home. The Archer tradition included a special breakfast, church services, and an open house for friends and neighbors in the afternoon. "And this year, we'll be celebrating our marriage as well," Mason added, his eyes warm as they met Nora's. The week before the wedding passed in a flurry of final preparations. Nora's school term ended on December 22nd, with a small Christmas program for the parents followed by an early dismissal. The children presented her with a handmade quilt, each student having contributed a square, as a wedding gift. "So you'll remember us when you're Mrs. Archer," Sally explained solemnly. "As if I could forget any of you," Nora replied, deeply touched by the gift. On December 23rd, Mason and Luke drove into town for the final preparations. The wedding would take place at 4 o'clock on Christmas Eve, followed by the reception. After spending their first night as husband and wife at the hotel, they would return to the ranch on Christmas Day. That evening, Mrs. Jensen hosted a small supper for Nora, Mason, Luke, Reverend Porter and Sally, Judge Parker, and Mrs. Whittaker. The atmosphere was festive and warm, with everyone offering advice and good wishes to the couple. "Marriage is a partnership," Judge Parker pronounced over dessert. "Like a good team of horses, you must pull together through all terrain. And remember that the husband is the head of the household," Mrs. Whittaker added firmly. "But the wife is the neck that turns the head," Mrs. Jensen countered with a wink at Nora. After supper, as the guests prepared to leave, Mason drew Nora aside for a moment of privacy in Mrs. Jensen's small parlor. "Nervous?" he asked, searching her face. "A little," she admitted. "But not about marrying you, just about standing in front of the entire town tomorrow." Mason's expression softened. "If you're scared they'll laugh, I'll laugh first to drown them out," he promised, echoing the words that had given her courage at the poetry reading months ago. Nora smiled, the tension easing from her shoulders. "I remember. That's when I started falling in love with you, you know, right there in the church hall." "Really? That early?" Mason looked pleased. "Yes, though I didn't recognize it until later." He pulled her close, his arms strong and reassuring around her. "I love you, Nora Graham. By this time tomorrow, you'll be Nora Archer." "I can't wait," she whispered, lifting her face for his kiss. Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold, the world outside Mrs. Jensen's boarding house transformed by a fresh dusting of snow that had fallen overnight. Nora woke early, too excited to sleep, and spent a quiet hour writing in her journal, capturing her thoughts on this most significant of days. Mrs. Jensen served a light breakfast, knowing Nora would be too nervous to eat much. "Save your appetite for the reception, dear," she advised. "Mrs. Hanson has outdone herself with the wedding supper." The morning passed quickly with last-minute preparations. At noon, Sally Porter arrived with her father to deliver a surprise, a small bouquet of hothouse roses and winter greenery, specially ordered from Kansas City. "See, I told you it was possible," Sally said triumphantly. "Mr. Archer arranged it weeks ago." Nora was deeply moved by Mason's thoughtfulness. Along with the flowers came a small package containing a gold locket with Mason's miniature portrait inside and a note that read simply, "To my poet, my love, my future. All my heart, Mace." Mrs. Jensen helped Nora dress for the ceremony. The ivory gown, with its lace overlay and modest train, transformed the practical schoolteacher into a radiant bride. Her chestnut hair was arranged in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck, adorned with small white flowers from Sally's garden, carefully preserved in water until today. As the clock struck 3:30, a knock at the door announced the arrival of Luke Archer, who would escort Nora to the church in the absence of her father. "You look beautiful, Miss Graham," Luke said when she descended the stairs, his usual reserve softened by genuine admiration. "My brother is a fortunate man. Thank you, Luke, for everything." Nora took the arm he offered, grateful for his steady presence. The short journey to the church passed in a blur. Despite the cold, townspeople lined the street, calling out good wishes as the buggy passed. The church itself was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons for Christmas, with additional white ribbons and candles added for the wedding. Luke escorted Nora to a small anteroom where she would wait until the ceremony began. Mrs. Jensen adjusted her veil one last time, then hurried to take her seat in the church. "Ready?" Luke asked as the first notes of the wedding march sounded from the church's small organ. "Yes," Nora said firmly, her earlier nervousness replaced by a serene certainty. The church was full, every resident of Lyndon and many from the surrounding farms and ranches having gathered to witness the union of Mason Archer and Nora Graham. As Nora walked down the aisle on Luke's arm, she saw only Mason waiting for her before the altar, his face alight with love and pride. Reverend Porter conducted the ceremony with dignity and warmth, speaking of marriage as a sacred covenant and a daily choice to love and honor one another. When it came time for the vows, Mason's voice was strong and clear as he promised to love, honor, and cherish Nora for all the days of his life. Nora's voice trembled slightly as she repeated the traditional words, the magnitude of the moment overwhelming her composure. But her eyes never left Mason's, drawing strength from his steady gaze. By the power vested in me by God and the state of Kansas, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Porter concluded. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. You may kiss your bride." Mason lifted Nora's veil and kissed her with restrained passion, mindful of their audience but unable to completely hide his joy. The congregation burst into applause as they turned to face them as Mr. and Mrs. Mason Archer. The reception at the Grange Hall was a true community celebration. Every family had contributed to the feast: roast beef, ham, turkey, and all the trimmings, plus pies, cakes, and cookies of every description. The band from the Harvest Dance provided music, and the floor was soon filled with dancing couples. Nora and Mason circulated among their guests, accepting congratulations and good wishes. Even Mrs. Whittaker unbent enough to tell Nora she had never seen Mason look happier. "You'll continue teaching until the end of the school year, I presume?" the older woman asked. "Yes, that's our plan," Nora confirmed. "Mason has arranged for me to ride to and from town each day." Mrs. Whittaker nodded approvingly. "Good. The children are making excellent progress under your guidance." As the evening progressed, many of the older guests and families with young children departed, leaving the younger people to continue the celebration. By 10 o'clock, Mason was able to claim his bride for the traditional last dance, a slow waltz that allowed them a moment of relative privacy amid the festivities. "Happy, Mrs. Archer," Mason murmured as they moved smoothly across the floor. "Completely," Nora assured him, savoring the new name. "And you, more than I can express." His arm tightened around her waist. "Though I admit I'm looking forward to being alone with my wife." Nora blushed at the implication, but her eyes held a matching anticipation. "As am I, husband." After the dance concluded, they thanked their guests and slipped away to the hotel, where the bridal suite had been prepared for them. Rose petals were scattered on the turned-down bed, and a bottle of champagne, a rare luxury in Lyndon, waited in a bucket of ice. Alone at last, they stood looking at each other in the lamplight, suddenly shy despite weeks of growing intimacy. "I have something for you," Nora said, breaking the silence. From her small overnight bag, she withdrew a package wrapped in silver paper. Mason opened it to reveal a finely crafted silver pocket watch. Inside the cover, she had engraved, "To Mason, all my love for all time, Nora." "It's beautiful," he said, clearly moved by the gift. "I'll treasure it always. I wanted you to have something to carry with you, even when we're apart." "We won't be apart often," Mason promised, drawing her into his arms. "But when we are, I'll hold this and think of you." Their kiss deepened, the restraint of the public ceremony giving way to the passion they had kept carefully controlled throughout their courtship. With gentle hands, Mason helped Nora out of her wedding gown, his eyes darkening as each layer was removed. "You are so beautiful," he whispered as she stood before him in her thin chemise. Nora's hands trembled slightly as she helped him remove his formal suit, her Eastern reserve melting under the heat of his gaze. Their marriage was consummated with tender passion, Mason's experience guiding Nora through the initial discomfort to a pleasure that surprised and delighted her. Afterward, lying in his arms, Nora felt a sense of completion she had never known was possible. This was home, not just Lyndon or the Arrow Ranch, but Mason's embrace, the sound of his heartbeat beneath her ear, the feeling of absolute rightness in being together. "I love you," she whispered, the words seeming inadequate for the depth of her feelings. Mason's arms tightened around her. "And I love you, my poet, more than I ever thought possible." They spent Christmas Day at the ranch, hosting the traditional Archer open house for neighbors and friends. Nora slipped naturally into the role of hostess, serving coffee and Christmas cake. showing guests into the parlor, and standing proudly beside Mason as he toasted the season and their marriage. As winter settled over the Kansas prairie, Nora adjusted to her new life as Mrs. Mason Archer. On weekdays, she rode to town to teach, returning to the ranch by mid-afternoon. Evenings were spent in the cozy parlor, where she would grade papers or write poetry while Mason tended to ranch accounts. On Saturdays, they often drove into town for supplies and to visit friends, and Sundays were reserved for church and family meals with Luke. By spring, Nora had transformed the ranch house with small touches that reflected her Eastern refinement without diminishing its frontier character. New curtains brightened the windows, books filled previously empty shelves, and a piano Mason's surprise birthday gift to her graced the parlor. In late April, as the prairie burst into bloom with wildflowers of every description, Nora confirmed what she had begun to suspect: she was expecting their first child, due in November. Mason's joy at the news was boundless. He immediately began planning nursery renovations and discussing names, though Nora gently reminded him they had months to prepare. The school board accepted Nora's resignation with regret, but understanding. She agreed to help select and train her replacement, ensuring the students would continue receiving quality education. Summer passed in a haze of contentment. Despite her advancing pregnancy, Nora insisted on maintaining her usual activities, though she conceded to riding in the buggy rather than on horseback, as her condition became more visible. In August, Nora's aunt surprised them with a visit from Boston, having decided that she should meet the man who had captured her niece's heart and see this Kansas wilderness for herself. Initially stiff and critical, Aunt Harriet gradually thawed under Mason's charm and Nora's obvious happiness. "I still think you could have made a suitable match in Boston," she told Nora as she prepared to return east. "But I cannot deny that you have found something special here. Your Mason is a fine man, and this life suits you better than I would have imagined." November brought early snow, and on the 18th, after a relatively easy labor attended by Mrs. Jensen and the local midwife, William James Archer entered the world with a lusty cry that proclaimed his healthy lungs. Mason, who had paced anxiously outside the bedroom door throughout Nora's labor, was overcome with emotion when the midwife finally allowed him to enter and see his wife and son. "He's perfect," he whispered, gently touching the infant's dark hair, so like his own. "And you are amazing." Nora, tired but radiant, smiled up at her husband. "He has your eyes. And your determination," Mason added as the baby gripped his finger with surprising strength. "Look at that." The first year of William's life was a joyful whirlwind. He grew rapidly, a happy, robust child who delighted in exploring his surroundings once he learned to crawl. Mason proved to be a devoted father, spending hours with his son despite the demands of the ranch. For Nora, motherhood brought new depth to her poetry. She wrote in the quiet hours of early morning or during William's naps, filling her blue leather journal with verses that captured the wonder of watching her child discover the world. By William's first birthday, Arrow Ranch was thriving under Mason and Luke's management. A successful cattle sale in the fall allowed them to purchase adjacent land, expanding their holdings and increasing their breeding stock. Luke had begun developing a line of quarter horses that was gaining recognition throughout the territory. As they celebrated Christmas that year, their second, as a married couple, Nora reflected on how completely her life had changed since that first day in Lyndon. She had arrived a solitary young woman seeking escape from grief, and had found instead a fulfilling life filled with love, purpose, and community. After William was tucked into bed on Christmas Eve, Nora and Mason sat before the fire in their parlor, enjoying a rare moment of quiet togetherness. "Happy?" Mason asked, echoing the question he had asked on their wedding night. "More than I ever dreamed possible," Nora replied honestly. "Sometimes I can hardly believe this is my life, William, this home. Not what you expected when you came west to teach in a frontier town." "Not at all," she smiled, leaning against his shoulder, "but so much better than anything I could have imagined." Mason kissed the top of her head. "I have a confession to make. I saw you get off that stage coach your first day in Lyndon, and I thought you were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. I deliberately positioned myself to help with your trunk." Nora laughed. "Truly, I thought it was just a coincidence." "Not a bit of it. I was smitten from the first moment." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package. "This is for you. An early Christmas gift." Nora unwrapped it to find a small, leather-bound book. Opening it, she gasped in surprise. It was a printed collection of her poems, professionally bound, entitled "Prairie Dawn and Other Verses" by Nora Graham Archer. "How did you?" she began, speechless with amazement. "I sent your journal to a publisher in Kansas City last summer when you visited your aunt." They were quite impressed. Mason's eyes were warm with pride. "There are only 10 copies of this first printing, one for us, one for William when he's older, one for Luke, one for your aunt, and the rest for you to give as you choose." Tears filled Nora's eyes as she carefully turned the pages, seeing her private thoughts transformed into permanent print. "This is the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me. You shared your poetry with Lyndon that night despite your fears. Now you can share it with a wider world." Nora set the book aside and moved into Mason's embrace. "I love you, Mace Archer, more today than yesterday and not as much as tomorrow." "And I love you, my poet," he replied, his voice husky with emotion, "for all my days." As the fire crackled and snow fell softly outside the window, Nora thought of the frightened young woman who had clutched her poems to her chest that first day in Lyndon, too scared to share her words with strangers. How far she had come since then, finding courage, love, and a home where both her practical nature and her poetic soul could flourish. In the nursery above, William sighed in his sleep, dreaming infant dreams. In the parlor below, his parents shared a kiss that held all the promise of their future together, a future that had begun with a simple act of courage and a cowboy's gentle promise. "If you're scared they'll laugh. I'll laugh first to drown them out." Through the years that followed, as 2 more children joined their family, Catherine in 1879 and Thomas in 1882, Nora often thought of that moment as the true beginning of her life. Not just because it led to her relationship with Mason, but because it was the first time she had truly believed in herself and her words. Mason kept his promise, becoming her staunchest supporter when she published her first full volume of poetry in 1880, which received favorable reviews in literary circles back east. He built her a proper study when the children were old enough to give her time to write, and he never failed to listen attentively when she read her latest verses aloud by the fire in the evenings. The Arrow Ranch prospered and expanded. William grew into a thoughtful young man who combined his father's practical skills with his mother's love of literature. Catherine showed a talent for music that the entire family encouraged. Thomas, the youngest, inherited his Uncle Luke's way with horses and spent every possible moment in the stables. As the 19th century drew to a close and the 20th began, Lyndon grew from frontier outpost to established town. The Archers remained central to its development, with Mason serving several terms as mayor and Nora founding the town's first public library. Through it all, the joys and sorrows, the triumphs and challenges that make up a lifetime shared, their love remained constant. deepening with each passing year. And on quiet evenings, when the children were grown and gone to homes of their own, Mason and Nora would often sit on their porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie sky, their hands linked as they had been since that first harvest dance so many years before. "Still happy, Mrs. Archer?" Mason would ask, the question a cherished ritual between them, and Nora would always answer truthfully, "Completely, Mr. Archer, completely."